Counsel, please state your appearance for the record. The clerk's calm voice drifted across the silent federal courtroom, but before anyone could answer, a woman seated confidently beside the defense table leaned toward her attorney and whispered with unmistakable certainty, "Whoever the prosecutor is, they'll fold before lunch." Margaret Whitmore Carter had spent decades believing that confidence was indistinguishable from power. At 59, elegantly dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected wealth without saying a word, she entered the courtroom with the practiced composure of someone who had always expected the world to bend just enough in her favor. Reporters watched from the gallery. Government investigators quietly reviewed their notes. The polished wooden benches carried the faint scent of old oak and floor wax, while the steady hum of the courthouse ventilation blended into the heavy silence that always arrived before history quietly changed direction. Margaret adjusted the silver bracelet around her wrist and smiled politely toward a pair of executives seated several rows behind her. They offered reassuring nods. Her legal team had repeated the same prediction for weeks. The government's case relied on thousands of procurement records stretching back years. Too complicated. Too technical. Too many missing links. They believed the prosecution would eventually negotiate rather than risk embarrassment in open court. Margaret believed them because believing them required no sacrifice. The courtroom doors opened once more, and several assistant prosecutors entered carrying neatly organized trial binders. Margaret barely glanced at them. None looked familiar. Certainly none looked intimidating. She leaned back comfortably, crossing one leg over the other. "See," she whispered. "Just another government paperwork parade." Her attorney answered with a confident grin before standing as the bailiff announced, "All rise." Every conversation disappeared instantly. Judge Rebecca Holloway entered with measured steps, her expression unreadable as she settled behind the elevated bench. The room obeyed her presence without hesitation. "Be seated." Papers shifted softly. Pens clicked. A clock somewhere beyond the courtroom walls marked another passing second. Judge Holloway reviewed the docket before lifting her eyes toward the prosecution table. Counsel for the United States. A woman who had remained quietly seated until that precise moment gathered a single leather portfolio and rose without unnecessary movement. She wore a charcoal gray suit, simple, immaculate, almost intentionally forgettable. No jewelry beyond a modest watch. No dramatic gestures. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her posture reflected years of military discipline disguised beneath civilian professionalism. She looked neither toward the cameras nor toward the gallery. She looked only at the judge. "Good morning, Your Honor." Her voice was calm enough to lower the temperature of the entire room. Evelyn Carter appearing on behalf of the United States. Margaret's smile vanished before she realized it had disappeared. The name reached her first. The face arrived half a heartbeat later. Her fingers loosened involuntarily, and the reading glasses she had been holding slipped from her hand, striking the polished floor with a sharp crack that echoed far louder than such a small object should have. Every instinct urged her to believe she had misunderstood. The quiet woman standing across the courtroom could not possibly be the same Evelyn she had dismissed years earlier as an overly serious young woman destined for an ordinary government desk job. But there she stood, composed beyond emotion, meeting the judge's gaze with complete confidence while never once looking toward the defense table. Margaret finally found enough air to whisper only 4 words. "You never told me." For the first time that morning, Evelyn turned her head. Their eyes met across the courtroom, separated by no more than 20 feet and nearly 2 decades of silence. Her expression never changed. "You never asked what I became." The words lingered in the air long after the judge moved on to the next procedural matter. Margaret Whitmore Carter stared across the courtroom, searching for traces of the uncertain young woman she remembered, but the woman standing before the bench seemed like someone entirely different. There was no hesitation in Evelyn Carter's posture, no bitterness in her expression, and certainly no desire to impress anyone in the room. She simply opened a neatly organized folder, placed a single black fountain pen beside it, and listened as the judge outlined the schedule for opening statements. Margaret recognized the pen immediately. The polished black barrel caught the morning light exactly the way it had years ago when Colonel James Carter signed birthday cards, holiday letters, and every handwritten note he ever left on the family kitchen table. After his funeral, Margaret had insisted that sentimental objects belonged in storage, not in everyday life. She had packed away nearly everything connected to her late husband, convinced that looking forward required leaving the past behind. Somehow, that pen had escaped her. Seeing it resting on the prosecution table unsettled her more than the criminal charges waiting to be argued. Nearly 18 years earlier, Evelyn had been 20 years old, quiet, painfully disciplined, and completely out of place inside the polished suburban home Margaret worked so hard to perfect. After marrying Colonel Carter, Margaret had imagined a comfortable future built on order, appearances, and carefully managed expectations. Evelyn never fit that picture. She spent weekends reading military history instead of attending neighborhood parties. She woke before sunrise to run through cold morning air while everyone else slept. Even as a college student, she carried herself with a seriousness that Margaret found exhausting. Conversations between them rarely became arguments because Evelyn almost never argued. She simply listened, thanked her stepmother politely, and continued making her own decisions. Margaret interpreted that silence as weakness. She often reminded Evelyn that discipline alone did not guarantee success and that the real world rewarded confidence, connections, and ambition. Whenever Colonel Carter quietly praised his daughter for her integrity, Margaret would smile politely before changing the subject. She believed integrity was admirable, but influence accomplished far more. Everything changed after Colonel Carter passed away unexpectedly. The house became quieter than either woman knew how to handle. While attorneys organized financial documents and relatives debated family keepsakes, Evelyn packed a single suitcase. She asked for almost nothing. No jewelry. No furniture. No share of the estate beyond what had already been determined. The only personal item she requested was her father's fountain pen. Margaret remembered laughing softly before handing it over. "It will not help you build a career," she had said. Evelyn accepted the pen with both hands and answered in the same calm voice she still possessed today. "It reminds me how he expected me to live." Within weeks, Evelyn had left without ceremony. Occasionally a holiday card arrived bearing a government return address somewhere in Virginia or Washington, District of Columbia. The messages remained brief. She was doing well. She hoped Margaret was healthy. She signed every card simply, Evelyn. When neighbors occasionally asked what her stepdaughter did for a living, Margaret always answered with a dismissive smile. "Some legal office in Washington," she would say. "Mostly paperwork, I think." The explanation satisfied everyone, including Margaret herself. She never asked another question because she believed there was nothing worth discovering. Now, seated at the defense table, she realized that assumption had quietly grown into the most expensive mistake of her life. Across the courtroom, Evelyn uncapped her father's pen, wrote one short note in the margin of a legal document, and closed the folder with the same steady precision that had once frustrated her stepmother. Nothing about the movement suggested triumph. It looked instead like someone continuing a responsibility that had begun many years before either woman understood where it would eventually lead. Judge Rebecca Holloway gave a brief nod toward the prosecution table before inviting the government to begin its opening statement. Evelyn remained standing for only a moment longer than necessary, allowing the silence to settle naturally across the courtroom. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice. She simply rested one hand beside the familiar black fountain pen and looked directly at the 12 jurors who would eventually decide the facts. "This case is not about assumptions," she began evenly. "It is about records. It is about decisions. And it is about the responsibility that comes with signing your name when other people depend on those decisions." A projector illuminated the courtroom wall with the logo of Meridian Global Logistics. Beneath it appeared dates, shipment identification numbers, and government contract references stretching across several years. None of the information seemed dramatic. There were no emotional photographs. No shocking headlines. Only neat columns of numbers and official documents. Margaret relaxed slightly. This was exactly the kind of presentation her attorneys had expected. Technical. Complicated. Easy to dismiss. Her lead attorney stood and objected that the government was attempting to overwhelm the jury with administrative material before establishing relevance. Judge Holloway considered the objection for only a moment before overruling it. Evelyn acknowledged the ruling with a polite thank you and continued without changing her pace. Every document you will see has already been authenticated. Every witness you will hear has first-hand knowledge of the events described. At the conclusion of this trial, the evidence will demonstrate not one isolated mistake, but a consistent pattern of decisions. Margaret folded her hands together and leaned toward her attorney. She is trying to bore them, she whispered. That is all this is. Her attorney offered a reassuring nod, but his eyes never left the prosecution table. Something about Evelyn's restraint made him uncomfortable. Experienced trial lawyers often searched for emotional reactions because emotions created openings. Evelyn offered none. She turned another page with measured precision. A timeline appeared on the screen. Shipments approved. Destinations altered. Inventory reconciliations delayed. Internal compliance reviews postponed. Each event stood alone, appearing almost harmless. Yet together they formed a sequence too orderly to dismiss as coincidence. Evelyn never accused anyone personally. Not yet. She simply invited the jurors to notice patterns. When identical decisions repeat under identical circumstances, she said calmly, the law requires us to ask whether those decisions were truly accidental. Margaret watched the jurors more closely than she watched Evelyn. Several had already begun taking careful notes. One retired accountant leaned forward with visible concentration. Another juror studied each date as though assembling a puzzle. This was not unfolding the way Margaret had imagined during months of strategy meetings. She had expected aggressive accusations that her legal team could easily challenge. Instead, Evelyn was constructing something far more difficult to attack. She was allowing the documents to speak before offering any conclusions. The defense attorney rose again. Your Honor, the government continues to imply intent without identifying any individual responsible for these administrative actions. Judge Holloway looked toward the prosecution. Evelyn answered immediately. Your Honor, individual responsibility will be established through testimony and evidence presented in the order approved during pre-trial proceedings. The judge nodded. Proceed. Evelyn walked to a display table positioned only a few feet from the jury box. She lifted a single contract from an organized stack. The signature appearing here authorized a change affecting multiple supply routes. She paused just long enough for the jurors to examine the enlarged image displayed before them. Then she carefully placed the document back onto the table without identifying the signature. Margaret felt an unexpected tension settle across her shoulders. She recognized the page instantly. Even from across the courtroom, she knew the formatting, the contract number, and the approval line waiting near the bottom. Yet Evelyn did not say her name. She simply returned to the podium and closed the folder with quiet confidence. By the end of this trial, she told the jury, you will understand not only who signed these documents, but why every signature mattered. For the first time that morning, Margaret realized the government was not rushing toward its strongest evidence. It was patiently building a foundation so solid that when her name finally entered the record, it would arrive supported by every page that had come before it. When the court recessed for 15 minutes, conversations immediately filled the marble hallways outside, but Evelyn did not join any of them. She stepped into a quiet corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the courthouse plaza, carrying nothing except the same leather portfolio she had brought into the courtroom. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished stone floor, and for a brief moment the building seemed removed from the tension unfolding only a few doors away. She stopped beside a window, opened her portfolio, and carefully removed the black fountain pen. There was no ceremony in the gesture. It was simply part of the routine she had followed before every major hearing for years. She uncapped the pen, reviewed a single handwritten note inside her file, then closed it again. Behind her, the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the hallway. Margaret approached with the confidence of someone determined to reclaim control. Her attorney had advised against speaking to anyone connected with the prosecution, but Margaret had ignored the warning. She had spent too many years believing conversations could solve problems before they became dangerous. She stopped several feet away, folding her arms. "Still carrying that old pen," she said with a faint smile. "I remember telling you it belonged in a display case." Evelyn turned calmly without placing the pen back inside the portfolio. "It still works." Margaret laughed softly. "Your father believed objects carried principles." "I always thought they were simply objects." Evelyn studied her stepmother for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes the person holding them decides the difference." Margaret dismissed the remark with a slight shrug. "You always did enjoy sounding profound." The hallway became quiet again. Lawyers passed in the distance without noticing the exchange. Neither woman raised her voice. Neither stepped closer. The years between them felt longer than the corridor itself. Margaret looked at the fountain pen once more. "He signed everything with that pen," she said almost absent-mindedly. "Letters. Christmas cards. Even grocery lists." Evelyn nodded once. "He believed every signature meant something." The words lingered in Margaret's thoughts longer than she expected. For reasons she could not explain, an old memory surfaced with unusual clarity. It was nearly 20 years earlier. Colonel James Carter had returned home unusually late after several weeks of reviewing overseas logistics reports. He had carried a thick folder marked only with a handwritten number on the cover. After dinner he sat alone in his study, writing page after page with that same fountain pen. Margaret had entered to remind him it was getting late. Without looking up, he had quietly answered, "Some records deserve another look." She had asked whether something was wrong. He smiled politely, closed the folder, and said only, "Sometimes numbers tell stories that people do not want to hear." At the time she dismissed the comment as another example of his meticulous military habits. She never asked what records he had been reviewing. She never asked why he locked that folder inside the study safe before leaving for work the next morning. Standing in the courthouse hallway years later, that forgotten conversation suddenly returned with unsettling precision. Evelyn slipped the pen back into her portfolio. "Court resumes in 5 minutes." Margaret searched her face, hoping to find anger, satisfaction, or even resentment. Instead she found something far more difficult to understand. Duty. Nothing more. Nothing less. As Evelyn walked back toward the courtroom, Margaret remained standing beside the window, watching the closed portfolio disappear around the corner. For the first time since receiving the indictment, she began wondering whether the trial had started long before anyone entered the courtroom, perhaps years earlier, inside a quiet military study where one careful officer had filled page after page with observations that nobody else considered important until now. The afternoon session began with the quiet certainty that something important was about to change. Although no one inside the courtroom could yet explain why. Evelyn returned to the podium carrying only one additional folder. It was noticeably thinner than the binders stacked behind her, but she handled it with greater care than any document presented so far. She waited until every juror had settled before speaking. The United States calls Daniel Brooks. A man in his mid-40s approached the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to careful observation rather than public attention. After taking the oath, he introduced himself as a senior military investigator assigned to examine historical procurement irregularities involving defense logistics contracts. His answers were measured, direct, and free of unnecessary detail. Evelyn asked simple questions that allowed the evidence to unfold naturally. Daniel explained how investigators first noticed that several shipment records contained identical authorization patterns despite originating from different offices hundreds of miles apart. At first, the discrepancies appeared insignificant. A delayed approval here. A revised destination there. None of them alone justified a criminal investigation. Together, however, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. A series of enlarged electronic mail messages appeared on the courtroom display. Daniel identified each message by date, sender, and archived record number. Margaret watched quietly, recognizing the formatting before she recognized the content. These were internal compliance communications from Meridian Global, documents she had not seen in years. Evelyn asked, "Were these records recovered from company servers?" Daniel answered, "No. They were recovered from government preservation archives after independent subpoenas confirmed they had been deleted from the corporate system." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Evelyn continued without changing her tone. "Did the recovered records reveal anything significant?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. They demonstrated that shipment classifications were repeatedly modified after internal reviews had already approved the original destinations." The jurors leaned forward together. Evelyn displayed another document, this one containing a sequence of approval codes beside electronic signatures. "Can you explain why this sequence attracted your attention?" Daniel pointed toward the final authorization line. "Because every revision required the approval of the same executive office before implementation." Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, but her expression remained controlled. Her attorney rose immediately. "Objection. The witness is suggesting responsibility without establishing personal knowledge." Judge Holloway overruled the objection, reminding the jury that responsibility would ultimately be determined after all evidence had been presented. Daniel resumed calmly. "During the investigation, we compared authorization records with internal security credentials. We discovered that one approval profile repeatedly accessed restricted compliance files using a personal verification phrase that matched historical employment records." Evelyn paused before asking her next question. "Was that verification phrase unique?" "Yes." "How was its authenticity confirmed?" Daniel answered without hesitation. Human Resources records showed the phrase had been selected by the account holder during executive security enrollment many years earlier and had never been changed. Margaret slowly closed her eyes for only a second. She knew exactly which enrollment process he was describing. She remembered completing it herself, never imagining that a forgotten security credential would someday outlive every explanation she might offer. Evelyn placed one final exhibit before the witness. "Did your investigation conclude that these records had been fabricated?" Daniel looked directly at the jurors before answering. "No. Every independent forensic examination confirmed they were authentic." No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the soft turning of notebook pages as jurors carefully recorded each answer. Margaret looked across the courtroom toward Evelyn, hoping to find satisfaction in her face after such damaging testimony. Instead, she found the same composed expression she had seen since the trial began. There was no celebration. There was only another carefully documented step toward a truth that had apparently been waiting for many years until someone finally chose to read every page. The defense expected the next witness to weaken the government's momentum, but the rhythm of the trial continued exactly as Evelyn intended. She returned to the podium carrying no stack of dramatic exhibits, only a slim folder and the familiar fountain pen resting beside it. "The United States would like to address the integrity of this investigation," she said calmly. "Because every defendant deserves to know that justice is built upon procedure before it is built upon conclusions." Margaret's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, the defense maintains that the prosecution has a personal conflict that undermines the fairness of these proceedings. Several jurors shifted their attention from the witness stand back to Evelyn. For the first time that day, the spotlight rested not on the evidence but on the woman presenting it. Evelyn acknowledged the objection without the slightest change in expression. The court has already reviewed this issue extensively, Your Honor, but I welcome the opportunity to clarify the record. Judge Holloway nodded. Proceed. Evelyn opened the thin folder. When I learned that a member of my extended family might become connected to this investigation, I immediately disclosed that fact to my supervisors and formally requested removal from the investigative phase. She placed a certified document onto the evidence screen. It displayed an internal Department of Justice memorandum bearing dates from more than a year before the indictment. For 14 months, Evelyn continued, I participated in no witness interviews, reviewed no evidence, and exercised no authority over investigative decisions. Another document appeared. It contained signatures from independent supervisory officials approving the transfer of responsibility to a separate legal team. Then another appeared, showing that a federal grand jury had reviewed the completed evidence before Evelyn returned to the prosecution after a judicial ethics review concluded there was no legal conflict preventing her participation at trial. Every page carried official certifications. Every signature came from someone other than Evelyn. Margaret slowly turned toward her attorney. You told me this would become the center of our defense. He did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the documents displayed before the jury. Finally he whispered, I did not know she stepped away that early. Evelyn never looked toward the defense table. The law requires impartiality, she explained to the jury. Impartiality is demonstrated through actions, not promises. Judge Holloway admitted each document into evidence without hesitation. One juror carefully underlined a sentence in her notebook before looking back toward the prosecution. Another folded his hands together as if the final missing piece had quietly settled into place. The argument that this trial was driven by family resentment had begun to dissolve under the weight of official records created long before anyone entered the courtroom. Margaret felt something unfamiliar replacing confidence. It was not panic. It was uncertainty. She had always believed people acted from emotion because that was how she understood the world. Yet every document Evelyn introduced proved the opposite. She had deliberately surrendered authority when emotion could have influenced judgment, then returned only after independent institutions determined the process remained fair. The distinction mattered far more than Margaret wanted to admit. Evelyn closed the folder and rested one hand beside her father's fountain pen. The evidence belongs to the facts, she said quietly. Not to me. The courtroom fell silent again. No dramatic confrontation had taken place. No raised voices echoed beneath the high ceiling. Yet the balance of the trial shifted once more. Margaret finally understood that defeating Evelyn would never depend on exposing hidden anger because there was none to expose. Every decision had already been examined long before the first juror was sworn, leaving only one question still waiting to be answered. What would happen when the evidence finally reached the signature that everyone in the courtroom now knew was coming? The following morning began with a different atmosphere inside the courtroom. The conversations were quieter. Reporters filled every available seat, but even they seemed to understand that the next witness would matter for reasons no headline could fully explain. Evelyn stood as the bailiff opened the side door. The United States calls Colonel Nathan Reed. Every eye turned toward the entrance. A man in his early 60s walked steadily toward the witness stand wearing a dark business suit with a small American flag pin on his lapel. He carried no medals, no decorations, and nothing that announced his military career except the unmistakable discipline in every measured step. After taking the oath, he settled into the witness chair with calm confidence. Evelyn approached without unnecessary ceremony. Colonel Reed, would you please state your professional background for the jury? he answered in an even voice. I served 33 years in the United States Army, including assignments involving operational logistics, humanitarian support, and overseas command responsibilities. Evelyn nodded once. Did your responsibilities require you to monitor the delivery of government supplies under defense contracts? Yes. Were those deliveries important? Colonel Reed looked toward the jurors before answering. Every shipment represented planning, accountability, and trust. When supplies arrived where they were intended, people could perform their duties safely and effectively. When records no longer matched reality, every decision afterward became more difficult. There was no dramatic language. No emotional appeal. Only quiet facts spoken with absolute certainty. Evelyn displayed another series of government records already admitted into evidence. Have you reviewed these documents during your official duties? I have. Do they accurately reflect the shipment histories maintained by your command? They do. Margaret remained motionless at the defense table, but she could not stop watching the witness. She remembered seeing his name years earlier in correspondence connected to Meridian Global. At the time he had been only another military officer requesting clarification about delayed contract adjustments. She had never expected to see him years later seated only a few yards away. Evelyn continued. Colonel Reed, do you recognize the name Colonel James Carter? The room became noticeably still. Reed answered immediately. Yes. I knew him professionally. Evelyn allowed a brief silence before asking her next question. How would you describe him? Reed smiled faintly. He believed paperwork deserved the same honesty as promises. He often reminded younger officers that a signature carried responsibility long after the ink dried. Margaret lowered her eyes. Those words sounded painfully familiar. Years earlier she had dismissed similar remarks as old-fashioned habits belonging to a career officer who cared too much about details. Reed reached inside a document case resting beside the witness chair. Several months before Colonel Carter retired, he mailed me a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it unless questions ever arose about certain procurement reviews. He handed the envelope to the court clerk. The yellowed paper showed years of careful preservation. On the front appeared one line written neatly in blue ink. For Colonel Nathan Reed. To be opened only if the records ever need another witness. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret recognized it instantly. Evelyn did not touch the envelope. She simply asked, Colonel Reed, did you preserve that document exactly as you received it? Yes. Why? Reed looked toward the jury again before answering. Because I trusted the man who sent it. The envelope was admitted into evidence without being opened. Its contents would wait. Yet its existence alone quietly transformed the courtroom. It revealed that long before investigators assembled databases, before subpoenas were issued, and before anyone imagined this trial would ever exist, one careful officer had already understood that the truth might someday require another voice to confirm what the records alone could not explain. When the court reconvened after lunch, the sealed envelope remained untouched on the evidence table, drawing more attention through silence than any dramatic exhibit could have demanded. Evelyn stood slowly, glanced once toward the jurors, and then turned toward the defense. The United States calls Margaret Whitmore Carter. A faint murmur moved through the gallery before disappearing beneath the sound of the bailiff escorting Margaret to the witness stand. She walked with the same composed posture she had maintained since the first day of trial, but the confidence that once seemed effortless now required visible concentration. After taking the oath, she adjusted the microphone and looked briefly toward Evelyn. For an instant, she almost expected to see the quiet young woman who had once packed a single suitcase and left home without protest. Instead, she faced an experienced federal prosecutor who neither welcomed nor condemned her. Evelyn approached with only a legal pad and her father's fountain pen resting quietly on counsel table behind her. Mrs. Carter, she began evenly, during your tenure at Meridian Global, Did you possess authority to approve modifications to logistics contracts? Margaret answered without hesitation. Yes, within the limits of company policy. Did your office review destination changes before implementation? Yes. Did you understand that those changes affected government procurement records? Yes. Evelyn nodded once. Every answer arrived exactly as expected. She was not searching for surprises. She was building a path. Please look at Government Exhibit 42. A document appeared on the courtroom display. Margaret confirmed it was an authentic internal authorization form. Is that your signature? Yes. Another exhibit appeared. Do you recognize this compliance memorandum? Yes. Did you receive it before approving the revised shipment schedule? Margaret paused briefly before answering. I did. Evelyn thanked her and moved to the next document. The questions remained short. The rhythm remained steady. One answer quietly supported the next until the jury no longer needed anyone to explain the connections. Margaret attempted to regain control. These were administrative decisions, she said firmly. None of them indicated that any regulation would be violated. Evelyn did not interrupt. She allowed the statement to settle before placing one final certified record onto the screen. Mrs. Carter, do you recognize the attendance sheet attached to this meeting summary? Margaret studied the page. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Yes. Were you present during this executive compliance meeting? Yes. Did the participants discuss concerns that redirected shipments could interfere with contractual obligations? Margaret hesitated. There were questions raised. And after those questions were raised, did you still authorize the revisions reflected in the following documents? Evelyn displayed the approval forms one beside another. Each carried the same signature already acknowledged under oath. The courtroom became so quiet that the faint turning of a notebook page seemed unusually loud. Margaret looked toward the jurors, then toward her attorney, before finally returning her eyes to Evelyn. Yes, she answered softly. Evelyn reached for the sealed envelope resting on the evidence table but did not open it. Instead, she placed it gently beside the certified exhibits already admitted into evidence. Your Honor, she said, the United States has no need to speculate about intent when the documentary record already establishes knowledge. She looked toward Margaret one final time, not with anger, but with unmistakable respect for the seriousness of the moment. No further questions. The words landed with remarkable finality. Margaret remained seated on the witness stand, surrounded not by accusations, but by her own acknowledged decisions, while the unopened envelope bearing Colonel James Carter's handwriting rested only inches away, waiting for the moment when its contents would no longer reveal a new truth, but simply confirm the one that had already emerged. The jury returned just before 4 o'clock that afternoon. No one spoke as the foreperson handed the verdict form to the court clerk. The sound of paper unfolding echoed gently through the courtroom before the clerk began reading each finding into the record. Every answer was clear. Every response reflected the evidence that had filled the courtroom over the previous days. Judge Rebecca Holloway thanked the jurors for their service before addressing the attorneys with the same steady professionalism she had maintained from the beginning. Margaret Whitmore Carter remained seated, her hands folded quietly in front of her. She did not look toward the gallery. She did not search for reporters. Instead, her eyes settled on Evelyn. It was the first time she had truly looked at her without seeing the quiet young woman she believed she understood. Across the courtroom, Evelyn closed her final trial binder with the same deliberate care she had shown when opening it on the first morning. She picked up her father's fountain pen, placed the cap securely over the tip, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her portfolio. There was no smile. There was no visible satisfaction. Only the quiet completion of a responsibility that had demanded years of patience. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Colonel Nathan Red approached the evidence table where the sealed envelope still rested. With the court's permission, the envelope was finally opened. Inside was a single folded page written entirely in Colonel James Carter's unmistakable handwriting. There were no accusations. No names. No predictions. The letter contained only one brief reflection. Records cannot defend themselves. Honest people must do that for them. The sentence was read into the record without fanfare. When the clerk finished, the courtroom became silent once again. Colonel Ridd carefully folded the paper and placed it back inside the envelope. He walked toward Evelyn, stopping only a few feet away. "Your father trusted that the truth would eventually find the right hands," he said quietly. Evelyn accepted the envelope with both hands. "He taught me that the law belongs to everyone, even when it becomes personal." Reed gave a small respectful nod before leaving the courtroom. Margaret remained standing near the defense table, waiting until nearly everyone else had gone. Finally she spoke. "I spent years believing you left because you wanted to escape this family." Evelyn looked at her calmly. "I left because I needed to become the person my father believed I could be." Margaret lowered her eyes. For the first time in many years, she had no argument prepared, no explanation waiting, and no confidence left to protect. She simply nodded once, turned quietly, and walked toward the courtroom doors. Evelyn watched her leave without anger. Some distances could never be measured in miles, and some conversations arrived decades later than anyone expected. Outside, a light autumn rain covered the courthouse steps. Reporters waited behind security barriers, but Evelyn chose a different exit leading toward the quieter side of the building. She paused beneath the stone overhang, holding the old fountain pen in one hand and the envelope in the other. The city continued moving around her as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Traffic lights changed. A distant train horn echoed across the afternoon. People hurried home carrying umbrellas against the gentle rain. Evelyn looked once toward the gray sky before placing the envelope safely inside her portfolio. She understood that the trial had never been about proving she was right. It had been about allowing the truth to stand on its own, supported by facts instead of emotion and by integrity instead of resentment. Her father had once believed every signature carried responsibility long after the ink dried. Standing on those courthouse steps, she finally understood that the same was true of every honorable choice. Some people spend a lifetime protecting their reputation. Others spend a lifetime protecting the truth. Only one of those legacies continues speaking long after the courtroom grows silent.